Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to the New Beginnings podcast. No fluff, no holding back, just honest conversations about your journey as a new Muslim.
Brought to you by New Beginnings, a platform that aims to support new Muslims on their journey through Islam, from the Shahada and beyond. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the New Beginnings podcast. I'm your co-host, Bilal Brown.
Thank you to all our listeners for joining us again. I'm your other co-host, Amanda, and today we're going to be delving into the topic of mental health, well-being and resilience for new converts to Islam.
We are joined today by our guests who both have a wealth of experience in supporting converts and others with their mental health. Sister Aisha Jasuleviciute, hope I pronounced that correctly, from Aisha Sukoon, and Sister Jodie Wozencroft-Reay, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly either, from House of Healing, CBT and Hidayah Neurodiversity. Welcome both of you, and big welcome to the New Beginnings Wellbeing team as well, which we'll speak about later on.
Jazakallah khair. Welcome to the podcast, sisters. Would you mind introducing yourselves to our audience? Aisha, why don't we start with you?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for welcoming me here. And yes, you pronounce my name very well, so I really appreciate that. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. As the host mentioned, my name is Aisha Jasuleviciute. I'm deeply honored to share this space with you and to have the opportunity to speak on a topic that is incredibly close to my heart. My journey to Islam began 18 years ago when I embraced this beautiful faith. Since then, I've navigated through various challenges and experiences which have shaped me into the person I am today, alhamdulillah. My journey has been one of self-discovery, growth, and a deepening connection to my faith that have fueled my passion for supporting others on similar journeys. That's why I founded Aisha Sukoon, a safe haven for convert women overcoming toxic relationships. So with my background in education, special education, and mental health, coupled with my experiences as a relationship recovery coach, I had the privilege of walking alongside many incredible women on the paths of healing and empowerment. Majority of those women are converts in Islam. Today, I'm here to share insights, offer guidance, and most importantly, remind you and myself that we're not alone on this journey only because we are converts. Jazakallah khair for allowing me to be part of this journey and the podcast today. And I hope we'll just embark this conversation and future work together with openness, compassion, and shared commitment to healing and empowerment of our convert family. Barakallah fikum.
Jazakallah khair, Aisha, for sharing with us. Jodie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Assalamu alaikum. So my name's Jodie. I embraced Islam almost 11 years ago. And 2 weeks before I embraced Islam, I became a psychotherapist. So for me, they are very parallel journeys. During my time as a psychotherapist, I've completed postgraduate training in cognitive behaviour therapy, compassion-focused therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as Islamic psychology. And I'm an associate fellow with the International Association of Islamic Psychology. Currently, I specialise with working with Muslims in House of Healing CBT and neurodivergent clients with Hidayah Neurodiversity. I also supervise and train other therapists and counsellors.
Excellent, mashallah. Welcome both onto the program today, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So as we mentioned, today's episode is focusing on mental health, mental well-being, and resilience for new converts to Islam.
Well, for Amanda and I have worked supporting new converts for many years now, and while converts do not view the topic of mental health as taboo, it can still be challenging to access the help needed. So understanding the common challenges and building resilience is very important.
Also, it's not commonly spoken about, but in my experience, many converts come to Islam through traumatic experiences, or they may have pre-existing mental health challenges that the challenges to adapting to a new lifestyle as a convert may impact. So let's take a look at some of these topics with our expert guests, mashallah.
I think I'll go to Jodie first. So first of all, what does good mental health look like?
I think for different people, it does mean different things. In terms of, if we're looking at diagnostics, we would look at how much someone is able to function, but also how much distress they are not experiencing life, but how much distress they can have resilience towards. So obviously we all go through difficulties, and distress is normal in certain difficulties, but having that resilience to cope with those difficulties and the feelings they bring along. A bit like with physical health, it is essentially how much do you function and how much does it get in the way of you being able to function and feel fulfilled and not necessarily happy, because we might be going through difficulties, but be able to return to an okay state depending on what your background is, your experiences. But yeah, it's that fulfillment and that level of functioning, really.
So just to touch on that, for practitioners trying to recognize if somebody is having poor mental health, you speak of this okay state. So how do we recognize those signs as practitioners?
I think it's looking at the individual kind of level of okay. So for some people, it might be praying all your fard and your sunnah and doing all the extras, and that is their level of okay. But for someone else, it might be they just about managed to do their fard and they just about managed to juggle cleaning the house and clothing children, and that's their level of normal. So I work with lots of neurodivergent people, and the idea of them doing all of those things as well as coping with the sensory difficulties of life, it's putting a kind of hurdle that not everybody can jump, and that's okay. It's not that one hurdle is better than another or worse than another, but it's looking at what the normal is for that individual person, not what they kind of quote unquote should be.
What do you mean by fard and sunnah?
It depends on who you ask. So if I'm talking about fard, I'm talking about your 5 prayers. For other people, depending on how new they are, it might be moving away from haram meat. It might be someone only eating halal meat. It might be someone giving up alcohol. So there is this journey for all converts. I mean, I've never met a convert, including myself, that woke up one day, converted and did everything right. And again, right in quote unquote, because that looks different for everybody, depending on what school of thought, etc. you come from.
So I'm just going to jump in here to say, for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with the Arabic terminology, something that is fard is something that a Muslim is obliged to do. Something that is sunnah is something that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, may have done habitually. We're not required to do it, but if we do it, we're rewarded for doing it. So just to bring everybody up to speed on the terms that Jodie was using. I'd like to actually touch on something that you said, Jodie, and this isn't in the script, and I do apologize for that. But and maybe, Aisha, you can come in on this if you like. You spoke about part of resilience being able to cope with the difficulties that life's challenges throw at you. What would be a good way of coping with stresses, and what would be a problematic way of coping with stresses, in your opinion?
You'll hear me say this a lot. It depends on the person. Generally, quote unquote, good coping or helpful. I find helpful and unhelpful more accurate terms than good or bad, because it's a bit didactic. I suppose with helpful coping, it is being able to face feelings and feel them, not block them out, recover from those feelings, whatever they may be, whether they're anger, sadness, grief, anxiety, fear, and then return to that functioning in life. In terms of unhelpful coping, it would be things like internalizing those difficult emotions and not processing them. It might be lashing out at others, whether that's through fear or anger, etc. A lot of people that I work with tend to hold it in their bodies, so their bodies get really quite stressed, and that can present in lots of different ways. It could be muscle tension, it could be not sleeping very well, it could be a lack of appetite, it could be actual physical pains, and that's usually when people are holding on to stress rather than processing it.
Aisha, would you like to add anything in your experience, some helpful and unhelpful ways of coping that you've seen?
So what I see from my experience as a relationship recovery coach that works predominantly with converts is their state of mental health determines how the relationship is going to start and the path is going to take. So how toxic or not that's going to be is dependent on their mental health, but also the relationship with themselves and Allah, the Lord. Because as closer you are to your Lord, as much you know about yourself and as much you know about your Lord, as better you're going to be in figuring out your relationships. So if you start any relationship being confused, not being yourself, not functioning properly in terms of mental health, but also physical health, it's going to be a lot more challenging. This is why it puts a lot more strain on practicing, your religion and putting things in order. So in terms of your prayers and fasting and other religious practices, they become a lot harder because these are the habits we need to try and reinforce and embrace as soon as possible. So from my experience, it is very important to try and address yourself and be as healthy as you can be before entering any relationship, really.
I think you've touched on an important point, and we'll come on to this in a moment regarding relationships and other things, other factors that can impact our mental health and also can be impacted by our mental health as well. I'm glad that we've sort of set this benchmark of what good mental health is, because without doing that, it's very difficult to talk about what mental health problems may look like, especially as Jodie pointed out. Life is difficult, and not every emotion is a negative emotion. Not every perceived negative emotion is actually indicative of a mental health problem. And I think that this is something that's often misunderstood. I've seen, for example, books talking about things like, a Muslim is never sad, which I find just deeply unhelpful, because of course we're sad when sad things happen. Of course we get angry when we see horrific things happening. And this shouldn't be an indication or taken as an indication that we have mental health issues, or Allah forbid that we have weak iman either.
That was one of the first books I was ever given as a convert. And bearing in mind, I'd just become a psychotherapist, I couldn't put the two together. It just did not make sense to me. And it caused a real crisis for me, because I was like, if this is what Islam is saying, but I'm learning this, and this doesn't go together. It was really tricky to navigate.
I can understand the idea of trying to encourage the new Muslim to internalize the concept of relying on Allah and trusting his plan, and therefore not despairing, not being despondent. We thought it would be useful to discuss some common issues that may challenge a convert's mental well-being or may be challenged by a convert's mental health. The warning signs, how to deal with, or even how to avoid them. Preventative measures are often just as important as cure, as the saying goes. So if we start off with regards to relationships, one of the most frequent things we hear from converts is regarding relationships with their pre-Muslim friends and family. What would you have to say on these issues? We'll come on to romantic relationships, marriage, and so on in a bit. But the relationships that we don't choose, with our parents, our siblings, the relationships we've had with friends, what kind of challenges do these throw up? And what would your advice be to new Muslims in order to deal with these, really? Aisha, why don't we start with you?
I had to undergo that process a few times, I would say. So initially, I went quite cold turkey with my friends, because I just thought we don't have anything else in common. We have different religion, different lifestyle. I just started backing off and isolating myself, which now I understand was probably the worst thing to do, because every relationship brings some goodness. And I think we need to start to filter and get the best out of ourselves, other people, and relationships that, we can get. So that, especially when it comes to family members, we need to understand that we cannot have another mother or another father or another brother just like that. So we need to appreciate that these members of our family actually know us best. So yes, as converts, we may struggle with certain aspects like religious rulings that our family members wouldn't be able to advise us. However, when it comes to personal issues, even choosing a spouse in the future, your own father or mother would know you better and would be able to advise you, instead of trying to go to someone who is religious and practicing, but they don't know you. When it comes to your friends, I think what's very important is to set certain boundaries. So to learn how to say no when you do activities that are not in line with your new values. You might have been okay to go out clubbing and pubbing when you were non-Muslim, but once you embrace your religion and you feel this is not okay, I don't want to do it anymore, don't go with them when they go clubbing and pubbing. Go with them when they go to play bowling or, go to the gym, do other activities that are still permissible. So don't cut people off. Keep them, because that's still your support network. Don't make that mistake that I did and many other converts do, because they go black and white. They just think, right, either go all in or all out.
So there is an area in between, that gray area, those all rainbow colors in between black and white, they matter. So embrace that.
Do you think that leads to more isolation? You know, we hear this a lot from new converts to Islam, the issue of loneliness and isolation. Do you think that because they are now cutting off their old family and friends, that actually leads to that?
100%. I stopped everything. So I stopped the activities. For example, I was professional rower. So I had to stop that because I thought dress code is not in line anymore with my Islamic values, and it was male dominant environment. So I cut that off. I cut all my friends, high school friends, newly met people, because they were of different faith. I went really, really extreme, and I was isolated. And then obviously I entered intimate partner relationships. I got married. And then I started feeling even more isolated because I was busy in my new role as a mother, as a wife, and I just felt I lost myself. So I didn't know what I like anymore. I had to figure everything out, learn all these new things, but I completely lost my old self, which was extreme, and it's not needed. So the loneliness and isolation is sometimes what we impose on ourselves, and it is not necessary, because we can just gradually make decisions as we go along, assess, and we don't have to embrace everything over one night.
Jodie, did you want to add anything to that?
I suppose I approached friendships a little bit different when I converted. I kept most of my friends, but I think there is a risk in that as well. So some friends were wonderful, and they came from a variety of backgrounds, Christian, atheist, etc. Whereas I had other friends who didn't like that there was a change and wanted like the old version of me back. So there was pressures there. I think the risk of isolating ourselves completely is that it makes us vulnerable. And we all know social media can be a wonderful thing, but it can also be an incredibly risky thing. So I know, for example, my local mosque at the time didn't do anything for converts. So I was like, oh, well, I'll go on Twitter. That's where I'll find my Islamic knowledge, because I was brand new and I didn't know any better. And I remember being told that I should wear hijab in front of my dad. My dad is my stepfather, so he's married to my mother and he has children with my mother, and he's raised me since I was about 4 years old. And again, it was this real crisis of, is this really what Islam says? Because he's my dad. I call him dad and he's raised me. So I think it's that thing of, don't cut everybody off, absolutely, but also make sure that you're getting your information from reliable places, because when you're lonely, you're much more vulnerable to it. I think it's really normal for us to have an awareness and anxiety around how we're perceived, that we're human, that is what we do. Some people will reject that and not respect these new values that you're going to embrace. For others, it's not a rejection per se, it's just that they've struggled with the fact that there is a change and it will take them some time. I know for my family, we had to talk about what a lot of the kind of commonalities between Christianity and Islam, for them to understand it wasn't this scary foreign thing that had come over. It wasn't going to change me as a person. I shared a lot of values, because before I was an atheist, so actually I shared more values now that I had converted. So I think allowing people to discover the new norms with you, and don't expect them to necessarily get up to speed at the same speed you're doing it, because it's a huge change for everybody.
I wanted to touch on this point of isolation and vulnerability, because, I mean, as Aisha pointed out, a lot of us will isolate ourselves, which can make us vulnerable. But then a lot of us become isolated because other people decide to cut ties with us, and that's out of our control. When we say, though, that when we're isolated, we are vulnerable, what kind of things are isolated converts vulnerable to? And what would be the warning signs of those, in your opinion? Jodie?
So there's a lot of research on vulnerability and loneliness through lots of demographics in human culture. It's not just converts. So I used to work with, say, young offenders. I've worked with children in care. I've worked with children with mental health issues, adults with mental health issues. And loneliness is one of the biggest indicators that your mental health is going to be negatively affected. We are social creatures. We do need connection. And I think it's being aware of that. So things like seeking connection, where if you were in a happy place, you might say, that possibly isn't the greatest place to seek connection. If you are flexing your values to fit someone else so that they will accept you, those things for me are red flags. So for example, things that brand new Muslims are pressured about, hijab. it's a very standard thing. Everybody has an opinion on it, whether they wear it or not, but hey ho. And I think it's that thing of going, you firm your view first, whatever value is going to lead you, and make that decision before you let everybody else have an opinion that is going to guide you, possibly negatively. So I suppose it's that thing of knowing yourself, that self-identity, which as a convert, it's a huge change. It takes time to get to know this new version of you.
Aisha, in your opinion, how could a new Muslim who finds themselves isolated overcome that isolation?
I would just say, allow yourself to do what you normally enjoy doing. That is a very important part. So like I said, for example, I was professional rower. So for me, when I was intensively training 3 times a day, every day, to cut that off completely, or going through stages of motherhood and thinking, well, I need to find myself. I need to do something for myself. So I went and I joined the gym and I was using rowing machine. So that was my alternative of finding a way not to be lonely and stuck at home. So loneliness is not necessarily being surrounded by many people, because for some people, loneliness is because they're just feeling low in their mood and they're not feeling like doing anything at all. Access organizations like New Beginnings and so many other local organizations that try to actually help converts in the way they know. So they sometimes just don't know how to support us till we tell them. So just be more proactive within community yourself.
Yeah, I think it's sound advice. I would add that not all converts have access to that. So we do have some of our students that live in areas where the nearest mosque is about an hour away. So it's not accessible for everybody. But yeah, like you said, try to access whatever you can. I know you touched on being married and you said you still felt isolated and lonely. And, we've had discussions in the past about where you've mentioned spiritual abuse as well. So I'll go to Jodie and then can we come back to you, Aisha? Can you just define what your understanding of spiritual abuse is and how somebody could still be isolated even though they're in a marriage?
Spiritual abuse, I would categorise under domestic abuse criteria.
You consider a form of domestic abuse, is that what you
Yeah. So I would consider it the same as emotional abuse, but rather than using emotions as the main battering ram, shall we say, it's things like, well, Islam says this. There's a hadith that says this. If you do that, then you're going to go and burn in hell. All those sorts of things that it's used, people cherry pick. And it's all about this perceived power. And I think as new converts, we can feel really like we don't have any power because there's so much we need to learn and we're so out of our depth that we take things almost as gospel from other people. And unfortunately, there are those that will take advantage of this because they want to control someone else so that they feel powerful. And again, this links back to my mention of social media. This is why it's important for us to check out the knowledge and wisdom from a trustworthy source, not take it as writ, because there's so many things that people could say. Like, for example, well, you can't leave the house without my permission. I've heard that from more than one woman that I've worked with. But it also happens both ways. I have spoken to men where the woman is a born Muslim and he's converted, and the woman will say, well, no, in my culture, we have to do things this way. And he's not happy with it, but he doesn't feel that he can question or argue against that. So I think it's that thing of if you feel like your spouse has got a power over you that doesn't feel safe, there's a difference between someone having a power over you that you feel you trust them, you feel safe with them, you have that, they are giving me safety and that's why I'm giving them power, then that's okay. But if you don't feel safe, whether it's physically or emotionally, psychologically or religiously, that's when we're erring into the side of abuse.
I wanted to add to what you've said. I agree with everything that you've said, but I would add to it as well. It's not always only within the marriage context that spiritual abuse can happen, though. I've seen it happen out in the communities where people are seeking, because of isolation, an in-group to belong to. They're seeking belonging, and they will join a program or a course or a study group or something like that, where the person in charge is very, very usually charismatic, but underneath are exhibiting signs of coercive control and spiritual manipulation and so on. And it often happens with, say, not always, but It can happen with a male authority figure abusing people who are under his so-called authority, whether those are young people or whether those are women, vulnerable women. So it's not always about a domestic situation. It can be as well out in the community. And again, not isolated, not restricted to Muslims. This is across the board in society as well. Bilal, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Aisha what her thoughts were on this, because she's mentioned this term and how she actually defines spiritual abuse.
Yeah, so I would just like to add to what Jodie said. I completely agree with everything that was mentioned, and it's definitely an emotional abuse form where people are using religious text to get what they want. So it's a form of manipulation, but spiritual side of it. So vulnerability that converts face is huge. So when you enter marriage, for example, and the marriage is quite toxic, so your spouse may be using religious texts against you to get what he wants in a not very nice way. So he would manipulate that text against you. So I would just say, and I would advise converts or those thinking about embracing Islam to check in with yourself, because no matter what kind of faith you are, what you're practicing, you should feel safe in your relationship. So I think communicating your needs are very important. And in return, how they're received, support and love, that's what you should be getting from your spouse.
There's a beautiful verse in the Quran in the chapter Rome, Byzantium Empire, where Allah says that from his side is that he created spouses from among yourselves, so that you can rely upon them, so you can trust on them. And he placed love and compassion between you. So it's that love and that compassion isn't there, then perhaps those are, red flags for us to look out for.
Jodie, you had your hand up.
I think this topic links in quite well with spiritual trauma. I've worked with many people where maybe they're on the cusp of leaving Islam, or they feel they have left Islam, or they're not even sure what they are at the moment because of religious trauma. And I think my main message to those people is these people are manipulators. They're very good at manipulating. It's not that you have chosen to be this way. It's that you have been with someone really quite emotionally dangerous, and this is what they do, and they do it very well. And often they have a very good kind of PR face to everybody else, so that they're loved in communities, they're trusted, and behind closed doors, they're very, very different people. I would encourage those people to come to therapy, because it'd be like me getting in a car and saying all cars are dangerous because I had a car crash. Cars aren't necessarily bad. The car that I was in might have been bad. The road conditions might have been bad. So yes, that's a bad car, but that doesn't mean that driving itself is this dangerous thing that I shouldn't do. Often our brains, to protect ourselves, generalize things. So for example, I've got a phobia of daddy long legs. I hate the things, they're gross. So my brain is generalized. I now don't like dragonflies and woodlice and anything with more than 4 legs, that just a bit icky. But it is my brain trying to protect me from something that I have deemed is scary and dangerous. The brain does the same thing when it comes to this sort of stuff as well. So I would really, really encourage anyone who is even wondering if they have been subject to this, isn't even sure, because you might have been gaslit. Again, they're very good at this. Come to therapy, have a safe space to just explore it. It's a safe space. We're not here to judge you in any way. Even if you're saying, well, actually, I went to the pub last night because I wasn't really sure what to do. Come to a safe space to talk about it.
Yeah, I like the cat analogy. So, you'll hear things from DV survivors like all men are dogs, and, things like that. And we should avoid that. Your father and your brother, and I'm sure you have relatives that are good men that aren't like that.
I used to specialise working with children that were domestically abusive to their parents.
Yeah.
I know for a fact it's not a man-woman thing, it's a power thing.
Yeah, even that is a generalization. Even the bear in the woods thing is a generalization, although we all understand it, subhanAllah. Sorry, Aisha, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. I just wanted to add that spiritual abuse is not just for the faith of Islam. So when I was doing my research for my master's in psychology and neuroscience of mental health, I was looking at the factors that affect Muslim women staying in domestically violent relationships. And I was comparing research because there's not much research from Islamic perspective. So it was heavily available on Christianity. So spiritual abuse is not something new. It's not something that happens in Islam only. It is predominantly happening in every religion. It's just if there are people that decide to gaslight you, manipulate you, and they have those toxic traits, they will use anything, including religion, to go against you and obviously to do things in their favor.
That's actually a really, really important point, because it is a topic that gets used by the Islamophobes as part of the oppression of women trope. We know that, yes, it does happen, but it happens with Christian communities. It happens with Jewish communities, Hindu communities, Sikh communities, atheist communities, LGBT communities. All communities have instances of abusive relationships in them. It's not unique to Muslims, subhanAllah. I'd like to talk a little bit, though, about a question that is often heard, and I'm sure Sheikh Bilal has heard this as well. Because we're Muslim and we don't, technically speaking, we don't date, we don't get into relationships before we get married. We meet somebody, we talk to them, we ask a few questions, we figure out if we're compatible or not, and then we get married. And we are tied more or less tied into a relationship before we really know the person inside and out. And I'm always asked this, coming from a Western background where we have relationships and we know the person like the back of our hand before we even get engaged to them. And sometimes, in some cases, people have had children and lived together and so on before they think about getting married to them. How do you avoid getting into a relationship with an abusive person if you can't know them as well as culturally you would have gotten to know them before Islam? Aisha, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, you're right in saying that we cannot sometimes, predict relationship, whether it'll be toxic or not. So one of the big red flags I see in people seeking relationship is that a person would want to marry a convert in particular. I see it as a red flag because especially women may be a lot more vulnerable, not knowing their rights, and they may appear to be as an easy catch for many born Muslims, in particular men. For example, lacking of Islamic understanding or knowledge, not being part of the culture where certain traditions are practiced, not being aware of mahr, dowry, where many born Muslim families would request from a man. In the same way, convert men are struggling to be accepted by certain Muslim families because they appear to be lacking Islamic knowledge or practicing to be good enough leaders, providers, and protectors for Muslim women. So just looking into those factors like cultural differences and clashes, how, the family actually culture is, not just religious practicing as well. Don't isolate your family members because they're not Muslims. Take their advice, take the experience, take the knowledge they have about you that you might not be aware because your brain might be clouded with the feelings or loneliness and wanting to enter a relationship, which could be too early.
Sometimes the trickiness with that is that people are already romantically involved before they enter into Islam. So one of the things that they really should do is the contract, have a solid marriage contract with lots of prenuptials in there, lots of conditions in there. Get it checked over by reliable scholars. Even the imam in the mosque, I don't think is good enough. So I dealt with a situation where there was a sister who converted to Islam, and she basically got duped by this guy who was in the UK from Pakistan. He didn't have any visa or anything, which she only found out later. They went to the mosque to get married. She was told it was an imam, but I think it was this guy's friend or something. And they did the marriage, and there wasn't a proper contract in place, and lots of things happened. We had to do a khula, which is annulment of the marriage, and it got very difficult. So having a really solid contract in place, I think, is very important. Even getting solicitors involved to sign it off and that type of thing. So it shouldn't just be seen as something flimsy, that it can be done in a few minutes and that's it.
I'm glad you brought up the topic of the contract, and Aisha's brought up the topic of involving your families, because I think there are a lot of converts who, as you said, they think that because their families aren't Muslim, it's nothing to do with them anymore. And that's actually not true, because yes, you are Muslim and yes, your spouse is Muslim, but the relationship is a human relationship and you still need to be compatible, and your families will know. I know a sister who lives in England, and she was speaking to a brother for marriage and made that mistake, not involving her family. And then somebody said to her, take him home to meet your brothers. And this man who she was talking to was just the textbook pious, mashallah brother, you know, with the way he dressed and the beard and his manners and all of the Arabic peppering his conversation and everything. And she took him home to meet her brothers, and he was so rude to them, just so insanely disrespectful to them. And she thought, Alhamdulillah, I followed that advice. You know, she was like, thank God, God has revealed to me who he truly is, because he was disrespectful to them because they weren't Muslim. And she thought, this is my blood. These are going to be my children's uncles. This is the closest family I have. And if I want them to understand Islam, they're going to probably understand it more through my husband than through me as men. So she cut him loose, alhamdulillah. So these things do happen. But with regards to contracts and safeguarding yourself, Sheikh Bilal, I'm going to ask you about this. And this ties into people seeking out converts for marriage. Have you noticed this phenomena of converts being asked to enter into, quote, simple nikah, end quote, in which there are no witnesses, there's no imam, they don't go to the mosque, they say a few words over the phone. And I mean, it sounds like, in effect, a temporary marriage. But I've seen a lot of sisters being asked for this. And is this just me that I'm seeing this as a woman, or you as a sheikh? Have you seen this happening much?
Yeah, it has happened, unfortunately. And, you know, that there have been cases, even with the temporary marriage, which is called mut'a marriage. There was a sister who did this, and she got pregnant. And the guy was like, you know, get rid of the baby. She's like, no, I'm keeping it. She was a convert sister. And, you know, it does happen. And again, having a proper contract in place, getting a scholar to check over it, not just doing these 5-minute sham marriages over the phone or quickly over Zoom, or not involving your family. These are all massive red flags. Or, you know, when all of that is placed, I've had sisters that, you know, they've had like a really low marriage payment, what we call a mahar in Arabic, like £200. And I've said to them, like, is that all you're worth? Is that all that you're worth to him, £200? He said, ask for more. You need to ask for, even if he can't afford to give it you now, just put it in the contract. It doesn't have to give it you immediately. You might not be able to afford it ever. You can, you know, waive it later on in the marriage if you feel comfortable. But don't, you know, give yourself up for cheap, you know. If it was somebody who wasn't Muslim, you know, you'd probably have a diamond ring or, you know, other gifts that are of high value. So things like that definitely need to be aware of.
So just to clarify, though, if a sister is being asked to do this nikah over the phone without an imam, without witnesses, without mahar, without telling anyone, or a temporary marriage, which I'm assuming everybody in this call is Sunni Muslim, and we know that the temporary marriage is valid in Shia doctrine, but not in Sunni doctrine. But these little secret nikah, are these even valid marriages? Yeah,
so, you know, there's debate around scholars about the validity of those types of marriages. The point of marriage is it's supposed to be open and public, and it's supposed to be permanent as well. It's supposed to be something that lasts with proper commitment. So the whole point of marriage is that there is a commitment between the husband and wife. And if you just flout all the rules to avoid that commitment, then you're actually going against the nature of what a marriage is supposed to be.
So being asked to enter into one of these marriages would be considered a huge red flag, is what I understand from what you're saying. Definitely avoid.
Absolutely, yeah.
You would think it's common sense, though. And I think this is where, and we've discussed in a previous episode about imposter syndrome, that so many converts feel like we don't actually know what we're doing. And so we rely on other people to tell us what we're doing, and things don't feel right, but we feel like we can't speak up because, oh, well, we're new, you know, and that vulnerability. So I think I'm just going to hammer this point home. If it feels wrong, chances are it is. And we should feel empowered to trust our gut instinct. And even if we feel that, even if they have all of the evidence in the world, we know that people can just take and cherry pick things. We do have to be wise to that double check, always ask. Let's go on to green flags. Because of this imposter syndrome, sometimes we don't trust our gut and we don't know what we should be looking for. So what would be some signs that a relationship is probably, and obviously Allah knows best, we can't tell the future, but some signs that this person is going to be a good person to get into a relationship with, or this group is going to be a good group to get into, or these are going to be people who will be good friends for me. What would you say would be some good indicators, some green flags to look out for? Jodie, do you have any suggestions on this?
I think my main advice would be to look at values. So if we're talking about marriage relationships, that's not necessarily just goals. So the idea of like, oh, we're going to have a house on the hill and we're going to get, a cat and have 5 kids, and that's all very nice. But values are this kind of almost golden thread that get you through life. So if your value is around having patience, if your values are around justice or learning, those sorts of things need to be discussed. Your spouse could differ in those values. So, for example, one of my passions is learning. I'm like an addict to go to university. I've gone a lot and I will keep going, inshallah, in the future. Whereas my husband, that's not a big thing for him, but he respects that it's a value of mine. I think as well as converts coming into relationships, it's about people understanding where you are at with your own family culture. So, for example, I know that Easter and Christmas come up every single year and people say, well, you can't do this and you can do this and da-da-da-da-da. Essentially, it doesn't matter what Twitter thinks or the rest of the world. It's what does your spouse think and will they respect where you're at? So if you go around on Christmas morning and you deliver some presents but you don't stay for dinner, or if you go around for dinner and then you go home, your spouse has to be on the same page, or at least respect the page that you're on, rather than saying, well, my family does this or Islam says this, because you're going to be at different points in your journey if they are not also a convert. Saying that, convert spouses will also be on a different point in that journey because it's very individualistic. So I think the respect of where they're at in their journey, where you're at in your journey, and like Aisha said before, that this fetishization of converts, as long as you're a Muslim, that's why I'm interested. Not, oh, you're a convert, so you don't have any culture. That is often what I hear. Everybody has a culture. We're all born into a culture, whether we're white, brown, or otherwise. It doesn't really matter. Everybody, literally every human on the planet has a culture. So I would say a green flag is the respect of that culture with where you're at with it.
Aisha, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you, Jodie. This is very important. One of the big green flags for me is that someone would introduce their family to you early on. And also you would feel really happy to introduce that person to your family.
Sheikh Bilal, what about you? From a scholar's point of view, what would be a green flag to look out for?
I think, that the person is... Sure, he's a person of compassion and understanding. I think for converts to Islam, it would be somebody who understands their journey, understands the family, understands what the convert has been through. Like Jodie said, is going to be supportive in where they're at that moment in time, without pressurizing them to, change what they're already doing or try to move at a faster pace in their, spiritual development than they're actually ready to do, which can lead to burnout, which is one of the things we should discuss, actually, taking on things too soon. And that's another topic, isn't it, that we can lean into. You mentioned about culture, Aisha, as well. Sometimes we have these clashes of culture. Do you think that for the convert to Islam, that it's better for their mental well-being to stay in relationships, whether they're romantic or non-romantic, that are in line with their own culture? Is that more beneficial from a mental well-being viewpoint, or does it not matter?
Personally, what I think, convert or not, what matters here is how you are as a person. So your temperament, how you are, and how easily you can embrace differences, what level of integrity you yourself have to embrace completely opposite culture to yours. So I think, like I said, convert or not, you just have to know yourself, and then you can choose a spouse accordingly, where you can embrace. Religion is only a tiny part of someone's culture. There are so many other factors, and like I said, personal individual values too.
Surely those values are influenced by the person's culture. And then you have some cultures that are less tolerant of other cultures. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. You have to consider everything. Like I mentioned, sometimes converts marry in very toxic cultures as well. Some kind of parenting way or way of functioning within society was acceptable, but it wouldn't be on the other part of the world. So you have to be very aware and familiar with the culture you're marrying into, because it's not just that spouse you're marrying into, you have to accept their family. So it will affect how you're going to have children with that spouse, what kind of parenting ways they will be using, because some parenting is very outdated and extremely toxic. And sometimes when converts become parents, only then they realize that this is not in line with my values, but that's a bit too late. So researching into how certain Arab cultures, how, for example, Emiratis parent, or how Europeans, certain, Eastern Europeans parent their children. So some truths are universal, some are very cultural, some depends on personal values and very much family values they were brought up in, the integrity levels. So it is very important to do your homework beforehand, inshallah.
Jodie, did you want to add anything before I give my tuppence?
The only thing I would add about culture is that the cultural norms are so ingrained that most of us are not actually aware of what we consider normal because of culture. So it could be really basic things like, do you hold a door open for someone that's behind you? There will be a cultural element of that. Do you show the bottoms of your feet to someone that you're not related to, or is it disrespectful? Do you shake hands with people, or is that not okay? So I suppose when you're talking to a spouse, whether you consider them the same culture or not, so for example, my husband's white British, so am I, but he's from down south, a completely different place down there. I say this with jest, but tell he is. So there are slight cultural differences because he comes from a very rural place and I come from like a semi-northern rural place. So I suppose it's asking those very explicit questions of how would you approach this? So for example, if you're having children, how would you approach breastfeeding? Is that okay? Can I do that around the house? Is that something shameful? Do I need to hide away? So that you're actually on the same page, because if you assume, well, Pakistanis do it like this, if you're not asking about very explicitly certain things that are very important to you, they're probably going to get missed because it is so assumed for us. It's so internalized that a lot of the time we're not aware of it until there is a clash.
I think you've brought up a really good point. And I did want to sort of add something in here, because one thing that I have noticed is something that I see happening frequently with regards to specifically white people who have converted, is the assumption, number one, that we do not have a culture, which is, of course, nonsense. We do. But we assume that too, because we have sort of had that idea ingrained into us that all of the countries that we colonized are the ones with culture, whereas our countries have none. And that is sort of across the board. My experience with very, very deeply embedded cultural differences, however, have been around guilt versus shame and how we deal with problems in relationships. So, and I'll just sort of explain what I mean by this before I ask everybody to chip in. My own cultural background, although I grew up agnostic, but my cultural background is Catholic. And we all talk about Catholic guilt. The Catholic mindset is you've done something wrong, you go and you confess. Now, even if you're an agnostic or an atheist coming from that background, something you've got wrong, you need to offload. We're a very offloading people. We will talk about our problems. We will go and and that is cultural. So if you're having a problem in a relationship, what do? You moan about it to your friends. You get people involved. You go and talk to your parents. You go and talk to his parents and so on. Now, in my spouse's culture, my spouse comes from a culture which is shame-based. You do something wrong, you hide it. You hide it away. Because what will people think? And in a spiritually manipulative term, it's you hide what Allah has hidden. So don't expose what Allah has hidden is a big one. And this was one that it's so deeply embedded, and it is such a foundational principle of living that it just became impossible to overcome problems, because my way of dealing with it was the guilt way of dealing with it. Expose it, talk about it, get solutions. Their way of dealing with it was hide it, brush it under the carpet, pretend it doesn't exist. If we're faced with something like this, which is such a huge issue, like this is really a very fundamentally different way of dealing with things. How, as converts, can we overcome this? How can we evaluate this in a potential, whether spouse, friend, learning environment, social circle, whatever? How do we figure this out before it's too late? Do you have any ideas about this, or have I thrown something completely random into the works? Jodie, you're nodding, so I assume you're understanding what I'm saying at least. What do you think?
I am understanding. English is a very limited language, is the first thing I would say. So we say guilt and shame, and we use them interchangeably. And actually, they're really, really different. So guilt is literally you've done something wrong, you've caused some harm to something or someone, and you feel guilty because I did a bad thing. You can get the inflated guilt where I did a thing and it must be bad because I don't feel good about it. That inflated, it's over and above what it should be. And then shame is I've done something and therefore I am wrong. It defines something about me and therefore I am a bad person. They're very, very common I haven't come across a culture that does not have guilt and shame problematically. If you think about like white British culture, think about Victorians, children were born bad. We were there to be taught to not be bad because we were born bad, terrible, terrible little beings that needed to be beaten, etc., etc. And often with white British culture, we do it with self-criticism a lot of the time. We tell ourselves that we're bad and we need to do better. And it's a bit like beating yourself with a stick and expecting yourself to be happy about it. It doesn't work. The thing with shame is that it festers in the darkness. If you don't shine a light on it, it gets bigger and more powerful. This is where communication is key. If you are looking at a spouse or a friend, etc., and they feel that they can't talk about stuff or won't give you space to talk about stuff, and you're someone that needs to talk about stuff, that is not going to fit how you process things. The idea of saying, I broke a cup and I feel really bad about it, and then a spouse turn around and go, you shouldn't have told me that, that's disgraceful, that's shame, that's not helpful. Often we almost inherit the way that we have shame. So whether it's from a parent or a teacher that's made a remark. When I was at primary school, I really struggled with maths. Maths was the thing that just completely baffled me. I now have an A-level in it. I clearly don't struggle with it that much, but at the time, it completely baffled me. And I remember my teacher saying to my mum, she just doesn't really get it. And I internalised that, I must be stupid then. And I still have that little shame voice, that little self-critic will tell me I'm stupid if I make a mistake. I'm not stupid. I know I'm not stupid, but the shame is a very powerful thing, and we all have it. So I think the number one thing is being able to treat yourself compassionately so that you have a bar of when someone isn't treating you compassionately. You have those standards ingrained in you of what compassion is and what you need it to be as an individual. And if it's not that, asking them to correct that or adapt that. And if they're not able to do that, questioning, are they the right fit for you?
Aisha, how about yourself?
Yeah, I would like to focus more on actual guilt aspect. I think you both summarized the shame really well, and it doesn't matter whether it's from religious origin or not. It is the big one for everyone. But guilt is something that, as a convert, you may feel like you betrayed your family. So you betrayed your roots. You made a different choice. You might have changed your name, like I did. And I had these remarks, some were very confrontational, and it was just said, well, you betrayed us, you left us, kind of thing. Though obviously, over time, they understand that is my personal choice, and I embrace it, and they embrace me the way I am. But I think as converts, sometimes we fear being labeled as betrayers, and we have that guilt because we think we're not going to be understood. We think that because we leave the certain culture or traditions or values of our family, we're not looking at big culture of the whole country or region we are from. We're just talking about certain values and traditions of the family, that if we change that, we no longer maybe take part in certain celebrations or events for whatever reason. Not everyone still celebrates their birthday, even if they're not a Muslim. So people sometimes make changes as they grow older. So I think embracing that without guilt is very important, that you are allowed to do what you feel is best for you, especially as Muslims. If we have the correct intention to please our Lord and we are happy with it, we have to just go with that. We need to try and move ourselves away from people pleasing. Just try and embrace who you truly are.
That's great advice, Sister Aisha. I just want to ask, what kind of self-help can converts to Islam access, and what kind of professional help can they access if they are struggling with mental health? Sister Aisha.
The first advice I always give to converts to try and reach out to Muslim services, specifically those that have experience working with converts or they're converts themselves. Sometimes converts, especially at the early journey, they may be overwhelmed already. They may be burnt out, trying to practice, trying to embrace, trying to learn. And if they'll approach just general counselor who hasn't got much experience working with different faiths or converts, they may tell them, for example, remember the last time you were happy, but the last time they were happy was when they were clubbing and pubbing, and they will start thinking in their head, right, so maybe that's what I need to do again to be happy. So I think getting the right support through the right people is number one thing I would advise to do. You know, whenever you can and however you can, seek that help from organizations that work with converts, and they can signpost you then to specialists and they can advise you.
Great. Do you have any other services that they could access?
So other services, like I said, are different organizations. So what I personally know is Solace UK, who deals with revert women in difficulty. So they support them, they provide talking therapists. Myself personally, I work with revert women that went through toxic relationships.
How do people get in touch with you?
On my Instagram page, which is Aisha Sukoon, and I have it linked to my Facebook. I have TikTok and YouTube account as well, but Instagram is what I use the most at the moment.
That's perfect. It's a good point that you made, actually, that, you know, religious people may brush under the carpet or just say read more Quran or pray more. And then somebody who is a counsellor or psychotherapist who isn't Muslim, they might disregard your religion entirely. Especially a lot of counselling theories and therapies, they are based on humanistic models, do not recognise the soul, they do not recognise God or any religion, and they may even take you further away from Islam, which is what we don't want. So it's important to find counsellors that are trained in Islamic counselling techniques and the psychotherapy as well, and they understand where you're actually coming from. Jodie, is there anything that you can recommend for people?
I think the main thing I would recommend for people is, how did you look after your well-being before you embraced Islam, before you were at the hardship that you're at now, whether that's to do with embracing Islam or something new. You don't necessarily have to give up all of those things. Pick the things that did help, that are still within the confines of Islam, keep them. So for example, I like crafting and I like crochet and cross stitch because I'm secretly a little old lady, but I enjoy those things and I can still embrace those things. Also, there are budget options for counselling and therapy. Obviously, there's New Beginnings, there's Inspirited Minds. If you've got the funds, you can go privately. The main thing I would say is, if you're going privately, check the qualifications and the accreditations and the registrations of the people you're looking at. If you are depressed, you need someone that is properly qualified to treat that. You wouldn't go to a doctor that wasn't properly qualified to treat a broken leg or an infection. So why are you bringing your mind and your soul to a room where someone isn't properly qualified and accredited, etc.? If it is a case of you're just struggling a little bit and you just need a bit of a pick-me-up and it's not a mental health disorder, absolutely, there's more of a range of people that you can go to. But if you are concerned that clinically you are not well, whether it's depression or anxiety, go to someone appropriate.
Sheikh Bilal, you were talking about making sure that whoever you seek help from is experienced and has understanding of Islam, and specifically about the convert experience and the convert journey. And I think that a lot of people might think, well, okay, I'm suffering from a mental health problem. And as Jodie just said, I need to find somebody who's qualified to deal with that. And surely the qualification is more important than the religion part of it. But I would counter that argument, because I've come across that argument, with this, that the vast majority of people in the UK are not Muslim and do not know any Muslims and have no experience of Muslims and Islam. And therefore they carry biases, and they can't help that, because they're drip-fed narratives about Muslims and Islam that they do not have any counter information to challenge that with. And if you go to a counselor who holds these views, they will undermine your faith in their sessions, and they don't even realize they're doing it. And I've had this experience as well. I've had some awful experiences with very, very well-meaning and very highly qualified therapists who simply were buying into the idea that my religion was the problem, that my religion was what was causing me depression. And, I'm very thankful that at that time, I'm thankful to Allah that at that time I already had enough Islamic knowledge to know that that wasn't the case. And to know that, the manipulation that I was going through was not, although it was spiritually based, it was not religiously valid. So, I was able to remove myself from that situation, but that alone could be very dangerous. So I don't think we can emphasize that enough. And alhamdulillah, there are very highly qualified and Islamically knowledgeable therapists available. You might have to wait a little while because they do have waiting lists. You might have to pay a little bit because they are private, but it is worth waiting and it is worth paying for, I believe. But also I wanted to pick up on one of the comments that Jodie made earlier on about your car analogy. And you wouldn't refuse to ever drive a car again just because you've been in a car accident. But in many cases, a lot of the situations that we're talking about that can impact our mental health, we weren't even the drivers. It was somebody else driving a perfectly good car that caused the accident. And that's the thing. What we want to do is to get to a place where we're driving the car and we are empowered enough to drive our own cars and to take charge of that journey, inshallah. I think we are actually running out of time, but were there any other points, Jodie and Aisha, that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
I want to jump in on talking about qualified and accredited therapists, and I do agree with you. I've had therapy in the past. So when I had my son, I had PTSD due to a difficult birth. I went to therapy, and during the course of that therapy, my counsellor, although she was very experienced and she specialised in trauma, she did not understand that the moment where I thought I might die was not the scariest bit for me, because I said, well, I'm going to go meet my Lord, so I'm okay. I was really scared that my baby wasn't okay. She just did not understand the idea that you're not scared of death. I don't get it. The other thing she didn't understand, during that period of treatment, it was a difficult few months, someone shouted some Islamophobic abuse at me. Now, I live in Cheshire, where 99.6% white British, not religious or Christian, and someone had shouted something at me, and I brought this to the session, and her genuine first response was, does that really happen around here? I just told you it happened around here. So I think even if people are coming from a good place, they can really invalidate your experience, because I just said it happened, so it happened. And the thing is, convert therapists do exist. We are around. Yes, we might be difficult to find sometimes if you don't know where to look in the right places. Obviously, we've got New Beginnings. We've got a whole list of therapists and counsellors that you can come to. But we are around. Please seek us out.
I would just like to add to what Amanda has said about getting back into driver's seat. Sometimes we just need to help ourselves. So there are basic things that we should focus on, which is, use your own intuition, which I think all of us have mentioned that, because we have that within ourselves. We just need to find it. So we have the answers. We just need to dig a bit deeper, give ourselves that time to reflect. So practicing mindfulness, journaling, setting boundaries with other people around us, which, if things don't feel right, don't rush. Don't take anyone's pressure to make decision quickly and on the spot, because that's one of the things you should avoid. You should really tune in with yourself and give yourself that time to make decisions without any pressures. Also, in terms of qualifications, so for example, myself, I have 5 degrees. I have quite a few titles and experiences and qualifications, but I chose to be a coach. So accreditation of my, obviously, previous experiences, and for example, my Master's of Psychology, and Neuroscience of Mental Health is a broad one. However, I chose not to stick with, for example, clinical psychology or just to be a counselor in particular area, only because I want to have a holistic approach. I don't want to follow one framework where I have to do certain things and I cannot implement my practices through the lens of Islam. So certain coaches may be as credited and valid as those who have, for example, counseling or psychotherapist title or accreditation. So be very careful, because some other coaches may also not have any qualifications and they will claim to know it all. So just be very critical, question people, challenge them. If anyone would challenge me, I would give them all the evidence, of what I have done and all the expertise and skills I have. So I wouldn't be intimidated by that. So if anyone gets intimidated, just make sure that you really assess and question, what is it that they're doing. Jodie?
I'm just going to jump in there, because it also, in terms of accreditations are great, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee you a good service. It's just like a certain safeguard in certain areas of the industry. The key thing to know is that to be a counsellor or a therapist or a psychotherapist or a psychologist, none of them are protected terms. So unlike, I couldn't call myself a doctor, because that would be illegal. If I said I was a medical doctor and I started offering services, that is illegal. But I can call myself a counsellor, a therapist, a psychotherapist, a psychologist with no qualifications whatsoever. So please check people out when you are seeking support from them.
I did not know that. That's a little bit scary.
I read it as well. It's not illegal in UK law just to.
It's scary. We're putting our mental health in the path of people that could do anything.
So like it's illegal for me to call myself an architect, but not illegal for me to call myself a psychotherapist. Ya Allah.
I was in the NHS for nearly a decade, and it was wonderful. Training was great and everything. But people have to wait so long that they're really unwell by the time they actually get into service, which makes it really difficult for the people working with them.
Yeah, that's very true. No, and the NHS is amazing. That's actually, but Sheikh Bilal, that's another title that doesn't require any kind of qualification, as being a chaplain. Bilal, you're on with our closing comments.
It's been a great conversation. Really great information and wonderful insights from our two guests. If you are struggling with mental health and need to access our services at New Beginnings, please visit our website at beginnings.org.uk/wellbeing, or you can email us at wellbeing@beginnings.org.uk, and you can book a session with one of our counsellors or psychotherapists. Thank you for listening, and final comments, please, from Aisha first, and then Jodie.
Thank you so much for having me here and for listening to me. Just finally, I would just like to say, for me, the most important thing is, an advice I would give the other converts is, get to know yourself best and get to know your Lord. Try and embrace your religious practices, get to know about Islam as much as you can, if it's possible, before you enter any relationship. So you are solid with your relationship with Allah first, and then you can enter and expand your relationship and enter family. Try to have that individual connection with Allah and embrace that. That's something that should be unbreakable.
Jodie?
I think my main kind of closing message to people is, look after yourselves and be kind to yourselves. None of this happens overnight. We don't wake up one day and, we're wearing a bayah, doing hijab, praying everything properly, beautiful recitation. It all takes time. I mean, it took me over 6 years to learn Arabic. I can now sound it out, but that's where I'm at. I couldn't pick up a book and read it and understand it, and that's okay. So I think being compassionate to yourself and knowing that it's not all plain sailing. There are going to be times where you feel sad or angry or frustrated, scared, and that is all okay, and that is all normal. Even the Sahaba, may Allah be pleased with them all, they had troubles and struggles, and it took them time. So my main message is to people to be kind to yourselves.
That's it for another episode of the New Beginnings podcast. We do hope you enjoyed this episode. Please share on social media and with family and friends.
Yes, please do share and subscribe. We're on all major podcast platforms. Inshallah, we'll see you next time.
I look forward to it, but for now, thank you for listening.
Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.